Have you ever found yourself waiting for God to show up in a big way? I mean, you're just sitting there, hoping for a miracle, right? But here's the thing. Sometimes, God asks us to do something before he moves. It's like, I want you to put your faith into action, even while you're waiting for me. Sounds wild, but that's exactly what we're talking about today. How our faith can work while we wait. Let's dive into this idea together and see how God's timing works when we take steps of faith. Alright, let's set the stage for this story in 2 Kings. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, you probably know about the big dramatic shift that happens between the end of 1 Kings and the start of 2 Kings. We're talking about Elijah passing the prophetic torch to Elisha. And oh man, it's a significant moment in the history of Israel. Elijah was a massive figure. You know, the guy who called down fire from heaven, that's him. And he had been Israel's prophet, confronting kings, leading Israel back to God, and facing all kinds of crazy challenges. But when Elijah's time was up, God had a new plan. Enter Elisha, his protege. Now, Elisha wasn't just a sidekick, he was the real deal. In fact, he ended up performing more miracles than anyone in the Bible except for Jesus. Yeah, you heard me right. More than Moses, more than anyone. Elisha's ministry spanned over 50 years, and he did everything from healing the sick, raising the dead, to even making an axe float. Not bad for a guy who got his start by simply following Elijah's example. But here's the thing, Elisha wasn't just walking in Elijah's shadow. He had his own unique calling. And that calling was tied to a really tumultuous period in Israel's history. At this time, Israel was divided into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom, known as Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. This split happened after King Solomon's reign, when his son Rehoboam couldn't keep the tribes united. So now we have two kingdoms with two kings, and this division caused a lot of political and spiritual tension. The northern kingdom, Israel, was often in the spotlight because of its wicked kings and its constant struggle with idolatry. In the south, Judah, though not perfect, still had a few good kings who tried to honor God. But the northern kingdom, not so much. Israel's king at this time, Jehoram, had a pretty rough legacy. He was the son of Ahab and Jezebel, yes, those two, who were notorious for leading Israel into deep idol worship, especially the worship of Baal. Jehoram wasn't as bad as his parents, but let's just say he wasn't exactly a shining example of righteousness either. He was a king that, while doing some things right, was still walking in the footsteps of the very idolatry his father had embraced. Now, let's backtrack a bit to understand the context of these prophets. Elijah had been the fiery prophet who stood up to the wickedness of Ahab and Jezebel, and you can imagine how intense things got with him around. But after Elijah was taken up to heaven in that unforgettable chariot of fire, Elisha became the prophet who carried the mantle forward. Elisha had big shoes to fill, but what's incredible is that even though he was the successor, he did things in his own way, God's way, and because of this, Elisha was able to lead Israel with more power, grace, and even with a bit more miracles than anyone would have expected. One of the things that set Elisha apart was his deep compassion for the people. He wasn't just about confronting kings, he was about showing God's power in practical, miraculous ways. And, believe me, he needed to be a man of action in those days. The kings, especially in Israel, had no problem leading the people into sin, and Elisha had to be the guy who continually pointed them back to God. His mission wasn't just about miracles, it was about showing God's real power, his authority, and his ability to change things, even when it seemed hopeless. But here's what's also wild, Elisha didn't just show up out of nowhere. His story was actually a continuation of what God had started through Elijah. So, while Elijah was the fiery, bold prophet of confrontation, Elisha was like the prophet of power and miracles. It's like if Elijah was the guy shaking the ground, Elisha was the one calming the storm and performing miracles to show God's grace and mercy. But I want to zoom in on one specific thing, and it's this. Understanding the context of the divided kingdom of Israel is key. I mean, we're talking about a kingdom that is split in half, with a civil war vibe running through the air. There's political chaos, spiritual decline, and constant infighting between Israel and Judah. Elisha had to navigate all of that while being a voice of God's truth. And, you know, sometimes the people in the north, they really struggled to see the light because they were so deep in sin, so stuck in their idols. They needed someone to help them see God's love and power, and Elisha was that guy. Let's also not forget that Elisha's miracles were meant to restore and revive. Every time he performed a miracle, it wasn't just to show off or make a big scene. It was to remind the people of God's power, to break through their hardness of heart, and to make them realize that God could still do amazing things even in the darkest times. So when Elisha healed a sick person, raised a dead child, or multiplied food, it wasn't just about the miracle, it was about pointing people back to God and reminding them that He could still provide for them, even when it seemed like they were on their own. So, understanding this backdrop, the divided kingdom, the wicked kings, and the call for Elisha to step in is really important. It sets the stage for everything that happens next. And as we move forward through 2 Kings, we'll see how Elisha's role as prophet becomes even more significant. His miracles not only changed the lives of individuals, but also shaped the course of Israel's history. So keep this in mind as we dive deeper into the story. Elisha was no ordinary prophet. He was God's instrument in a time when Israel needed it most. His journey is filled with powerful moments that reveal how God can work through anyone, even in the midst of chaos. Elisha's life is a reminder that even when things seem hopeless, God can still move in miraculous ways, and that's what we're about to explore together. Now, let's talk about King Jehoram and his reign over Israel. This guy's story is pretty interesting, but it's also pretty messy. You see, Jehoram came from a pretty, well, let's just say colorful family. His dad was Ahab, probably one of the most infamous kings in Israel's history, and his mom was Jezebel. Yeah, that Jezebel, the one who led Israel into all sorts of idolatry and wickedness. So, Jehoram had some big shoes to fill, and not in a good way. You could say he was kind of a product of his upbringing, right? His parents were notorious for their evil ways, and Jehoram followed in those footsteps. But, as we'll see, he didn't exactly measure up to the full level of wickedness they reached. But don't be fooled, he was still a pretty bad king. When Jehoram took over the throne of Israel, it wasn't like a fresh start or anything. Israel was already in a bad place spiritually, politically, and socially. The kingdom was divided, and things were tense between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. But even with all the chaos around him, Jehoram didn't do much to change things. Instead, he continued the path of idolatry that had been set by his father. The Bible says that Jehoram did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not quite as bad as Ahab and Jezebel. So basically, he wasn't as extreme as his parents, but he was still pretty bad. Now, one of the big things Jehoram did was, well, he didn't completely follow in his parents' footsteps. He actually took down one of the sacred pillars of Baal, but don't give him too much credit because he still continued in the sinful ways of Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom. Jeroboam had set up these golden calves for the people to worship, and Jehoram, well, he didn't get rid of them. He still allowed the people to worship these idols, and that's a big deal. It's like taking one step in the right direction, but then 2 steps backward. Now, let's talk about Moab. This is where things get really interesting. Moab was a neighboring nation to Israel, and they had been paying tribute to Israel for years, kind of like a little tax that they had to send to the northern kingdom. But when Ahab died and Jehoram took the throne, Moab decided they'd had enough of paying taxes to Israel. They figured, hey, this is a perfect time to rebel. Ahab's gone, and now we've got a new king. Maybe he'll be weak and won't do anything about it. So, the king of Moab, a guy named Mesha, decides to stop paying tribute and rebels against Jehoram. It's kind of funny when you think about it. Here's Moab, a small nation, looking at Israel, a divided kingdom with a new king, and thinking, now's our chance. They probably didn't expect Jehoram to do much in response, considering the political instability and how weak Israel had become. But what they didn't count on was Jehoram's pride, and maybe a little bit of his desperation. So, Jehoram, now faced with rebellion from Moab, has to figure out what to do next. This is where things get a little messy for Jehoram. What does he do when Moab rebels? Well, he decides to call in a favor from Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, the southern kingdom. Now, Jehoshaphat was one of the good kings in the Bible. He's actually considered a godly king, and you don't hear that too often when it comes to the kings of Israel and Judah. So, Jehoram sends a message to Jehoshaphat, asking for his help in dealing with Moab. Now, remember, Israel and Judah were separated at this point, but they were still both part of the same 12 tribes, so there was a sense of unity there. Even if it wasn't a perfect one, Jehoshaphat, being the good king that he was, agrees to help Jehoram. And so, the two kings, along with the king of Edom, who was another neighboring nation, decide to team up and go to war against Moab. They form this coalition to fight Mesha and his rebellious nation. But there's just one little problem. They have no water. Yeah, the army marches into the wilderness, and before long, they find themselves in a really bad situation. They've been on the move for days, and the whole army and their animals are running out of water. It's like a desperate scene out of a western, you know, with the army looking around at each other, just waiting for something to happen. Jehoram, in the middle of this, starts freaking out. He says, "We're all going to die out here. God has brought us together just to deliver us into the hands of Moab." It's like the worst case scenario, right? No water, no hope, and everything's falling apart. But then, in the midst of all this chaos, we see a glimmer of hope in the form of Jehoshaphat, while Jehoram is kind of panicking. Jehoshaphat, being the wise, godly king that he is, says, "Hey, is there not a prophet of the Lord here? Someone we can inquire of?" And this is key. Even though the situation looks bleak, Jehoshaphat recognizes that they need to seek God's guidance. He doesn't just throw in the towel and say, "Well, we're on our own now." No, he says, "Let's ask God for help." And that's when they find Elisha. Now, Elisha wasn't exactly thrilled to be helping Jehoram, but he agrees to help because of Jehoshaphat. Elisha's like, "If it weren't for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even look at you." But in the end, Elisha does what prophets do best. He brings God's word to the situation. And that's when we see something miraculous happen. Something that only God could pull off. But let's hold on to that for a minute and appreciate the mess Jehoram finds himself in. He's facing rebellion, political tension, and now he's facing the wrath of God's prophet. Talk about a rough start to his reign. So, Jehoram's story is really a reminder that even if you don't follow in your parents' exact footsteps, the impact of bad decisions can still weigh on you. He may not have been as evil as Ahab and Jezebel, but he still had a lot to answer for. And when things go south, like they did with Moab, you really see the character of the man, right? Jehoram's panic and poor decision-making contrast so sharply with Jehoshaphat's wisdom and faith. It's like a tale of two kings, one who walks in the ways of his parents and reaps the consequences, and the other who seeks God and finds direction. So, the tension's high. Things are looking pretty grim, and Jehoram's leadership is in full view, but of course, God's got a plan, and it's about to unfold in a way no one saw coming. Stick with me. We're gonna dive deeper into how God shows up in the middle of all this mess, and it's going to be one heck of a story. Alright, so here we are. The situation is getting worse, and now we're about to see a really powerful moment in this story. Picture this. Jehoram, the king of Israel, is completely freaking out. They're stranded in the desert with no water. And he's convinced that God has brought them here just to let them die in the hands of the Moabites. But then, here's where Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, steps in. Instead of just throwing up his hands in despair like Jehoram, Jehoshaphat does something crucial. He seeks God's guidance. Now, this is a pretty big deal. You see, Jehoram is kind of caught in his own panic and pride, but Jehoshaphat is a man of faith. He's got a clear perspective, and he knows that when things go south, the first thing you need to do is go to God. Jehoshaphat asks a question that really stands out in the midst of all this chaos. Is there not a prophet of the Lord here that we may inquire of the Lord by him? Basically, he's saying, we need to hear from God. We've been marching for days, we're running out of water, and we're about to face disaster, but before we do anything else, let's check in with God. It's such a powerful moment. Jehoshaphat's decision is a great example for us. How many times do we try to handle a crisis on our own? We get overwhelmed, we make rash decisions, or we just start panicking, thinking we can fix everything by ourselves. But Jehoshaphat shows us that the wise thing to do is to hit pause and seek God first, especially when things feel out of control. And that's what makes Jehoshaphat stand out. He knew the best thing to do was to humble himself, ask the right question, and put the situation in God's hands. It's like saying, God, we don't have the answers, but we know you do. Now, once Jehoshaphat asks for a prophet of the Lord, Elisha is mentioned. You see, Elisha wasn't exactly eager to get involved at first. Remember, Elisha had been pretty clear about his feelings toward Jehoram. Jehoram wasn't exactly a righteous king, and Elisha had no real reason to help him. In fact, Elisha actually tells Jehoram, "What have I to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and your mother." He's calling out Jehoram's evil lineage here, his father Ahab and mother Jezebel, who were notorious for leading Israel into idol worship. So Elisha's response is kind of harsh, right? But here's the twist. Elisha only agrees to help because of Jehoshaphat. He says, "If it weren't for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even look at you." And yet, Elisha, being the prophet of the Lord, agrees to give them God's word. But even with Elisha's reluctant involvement, there's something incredibly powerful that happens next. After agreeing to help, Elisha asks for a musician. This might seem like an odd request, right? You've got an entire army dying of thirst, a king in panic, and Elisha says, "Bring me a musician." But here's where we get to a key moment in the story. Elisha knew that God's presence often comes when worship is involved. Music, in this case, is not just a random thing. It's an invitation for God's presence to show up in the situation. This is more than just a cool song in the background. This is symbolic. The musician wasn't just there to entertain or soothe nerves. No, the music was an offering that prepared the atmosphere for God to speak and move. Now, when the musician starts playing, something incredible happens. The hand of the Lord comes upon Elisha. You see, there's something about music and worship that invites God's presence into a space in a way that almost nothing else can. It's like God is saying, "I'm ready to move now, you've created the space for me, and I'm going to show up." And in this case, when the music plays, God speaks through Elisha, giving the kings the answer they need. It's a direct connection between worship, the presence of God, and hearing his voice. And here's the thing, this isn't just an Old Testament thing. We still see this today. Worship has this incredible ability to invite God into our situations, to soften our hearts, and to open our ears to hear from him. Whether you're facing a tough time or just trying to find peace, there's something powerful about turning to God through worship. Elisha then delivers the word from the Lord. God tells them to dig ditches in the valley. No wind, no rain, but the valley will be filled with water. It's one of those moments where God does something completely unexpected. If I'm Jehoram or Jehoshaphat, I'm probably expecting some kind of big dramatic miracle, like a storm rolling in or some huge display of power. But God's miracle comes in a quiet, unexpected way through their obedience to dig ditches. It's a little strange, right? God says, "You won't see the wind or rain, but the valley will be filled with water." And here's the kicker. God's miracle often requires us to take action first, just like the digging of ditches. That's faith in action. But let's go back to the fact that it was music that set the stage for God to move. I think it's a beautiful reminder that we often need to pause, reset, and invite God into our circumstances through worship before we make any decisions or try to fix things ourselves. In our lives, we often face situations that seem hopeless, but worship and seeking God's guidance can make all the difference. It's a posture of humility that says, "God, I don't have the answers, but I trust that you do. In the midst of crisis, Jehoshaphat's decision to seek God and Elisha's willingness to speak on God's behalf show us how important it is to humble ourselves, to worship, and to wait for God's word. Sometimes, like in this story, the answer won't come in the way we expect, but it will come. And when we make space for God through worship and prayer, He always has a way of guiding us, just as He did with the kings of Israel and Judah. The powerful takeaway here is that in our own moments of crisis, when we're tempted to panic or act rashly, we can find peace and direction by seeking God first, inviting His presence, and trusting His timing. And when we do that, He shows up. He always does. So, let's dive into this incredible moment in the story where God steps in with a miracle that's both unexpected and, in many ways, a little counterintuitive. The situation is dire, right? The army is in the middle of a desert, no water to drink, and they're running out of options. Jehoram is already freaking out, convinced that they're all gonna die out there. But then, Elisha, after hearing from God, delivers a message that changes everything. And what's the first thing God tells them to do? Dig ditches. Wait. What? Dig ditches? That's the solution. Now, if you're anything like me, you might have thought, this is a little strange. I mean, the problem here is water, and God's telling them to dig ditches, not go searching for an oasis or pray for rain. But that's exactly what happens, Elisha says. Make this valley full of ditches. And here's the kicker, they wouldn't see wind or rain, but the valley would still be filled with water. In other words, God was going to bring a miracle, but He wasn't going to just drop it in their laps. They had to take action first. They had to step out in faith, even though there was no clear sign that anything was about to change. And that's the beauty of this moment. It's a powerful picture of what faith in action really looks like. You see, God's miracles often require us to step out and do something before we see the breakthrough. It's like He's saying, I'm going to provide, but you have to do your part first. And sometimes, that part doesn't always make sense. It's like being asked to dig ditches in a desert with no water in sight. It feels strange, almost like you're just digging a hole for no reason. But that's where faith comes in. God often calls us to do something that doesn't make sense in the natural before He moves in the supernatural. I think this story is so relatable to our everyday lives. How many times have we faced situations where we feel stuck or hopeless, and the answer doesn't come immediately? Maybe you've been waiting for something, a job, a relationship to heal, a financial breakthrough, and you're wondering when God is going to show up. It's easy to feel like you're just waiting around for a miracle, right? But what if God is asking you to dig ditches in the meantime? What if the very act of stepping out in faith, even when it doesn't make sense, is exactly what prepares you to receive the miracle? Think about it. When the Israelites dug those ditches, they were essentially preparing the ground for God to fill. It wasn't just about the physical digging, it was about creating space for God to work. Sometimes in life, we need to do the same thing. We need to create space in our lives, in our schedules, in our hearts for God to move. That could mean taking a step of faith, even if we don't see the result right away. It could mean investing time, money, or effort in something that seems impossible, trusting that God will come through in His perfect timing. Let's break this down a little further. When God tells the army to dig ditches, they have to choose to believe that God is going to do something, even though there's no visible sign of it. They didn't have any rain clouds in the sky. There were no winds stirring up the sand, no sign of a flash flood coming their way. All they had was God's word through Elisha, but that was enough. And so they dug. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't something they could look at and go, oh yeah, this is definitely gonna lead to water. No, they had to dig those ditches in faith, trusting that God was gonna bring the water, even though they couldn't see how it was going to happen. It's the same with us, right? When we take steps of faith, it's not always easy to see how things will turn out. Maybe you're facing a tough situation and you don't have all the answers, but God might be calling you to do something, to dig a ditch, so to speak. Maybe it's making a decision that doesn't make sense, like changing your career path, making a financial sacrifice, or stepping out in a relationship. Maybe it's something small, like being kind to someone who hasn't treated you well, or taking the first step toward forgiveness. Those may feel like ditches you're digging, but in reality, you're making space for God's miracle to unfold. Think about the times in your life when you've had to take that leap of faith. When you look back, you might realize that the step you took, though it seemed risky at the time, was actually preparing you for something greater. It's like building the foundation for a house. You don't see the house right away, but every bit of effort you put in creates a space for something to grow. Now, let's get back to the story. After they dig the ditches, God keeps his promise. The next morning, when the grain offering was offered, the water came from Edom and filled the valley. The soldiers, the animals, they all had enough to drink. But notice something important. The water didn't just magically appear. It didn't just fall from the sky. It came through a natural process that God had orchestrated. The ditches were filled with water because they had been prepared to receive it. That's the thing about God's miracles. They often don't look like we expect them to. God is going to provide, but we have a role in the process. Our faith, our obedience, our willingness to step out and dig ditches plays a part in how God moves. Now, think about the way we experience miracles in our own lives. It's easy to think of a miracle as something that happens out of nowhere, like God just drops a blessing into our laps. But often, God works through the things we do. He asks us to take steps of faith, to make decisions, to prepare ourselves for the breakthrough. It's like God is saying, I'm going to fill those ditches, but you have to dig them first. Maybe that means stepping out of your comfort zone, believing in something before you see the results, or trusting God when things seem impossible. And here's the thing, when we take those steps of faith, we're not just doing it for the miracle, we're doing it to deepen our trust in God. Every time we dig a ditch, every time we make space for God to move, we're saying, God, I trust that you'll show up. And when he does, it strengthens our faith. The next time God asks us to dig a ditch, we'll be a little more confident, a little more sure that he'll come through. In your own life, what are the ditches God might be asking you to dig right now? Maybe you're in a season of waiting for a miracle, and God is asking you to do something that doesn't make sense. Maybe it's a financial step, a relational decision, or something else entirely. Whatever it is, trust that God is asking you to prepare the ground for his miracle. He's going to fill those ditches, but you've got to dig them first. And when you do, just like the Israelites in the desert, you'll see God move in a powerful way. His miracles aren't just about the end result. They're about the process, about learning to trust him every step of the way. So, take that step of faith. Dig that ditch. Make space for God to show up. And when he does, you'll see his provision in ways you never expected. So, now let's look at one of the most interesting, and let's be honest, a little bit hilarious, parts of this story. After God provides the water, the Moabites see what they think is a big bloody mess. Remember, the Israelites had just dug all those ditches, and overnight, the valley was filled with water. But when the Moabites show up in the morning, they see these red pools of water reflecting the sunrise, and they immediately jump to the conclusion that Israel's army must have turned on each other. They think there's been a battle, and the blood of the fallen soldiers is everywhere. So, what do? They think, the enemy is defeated. They've destroyed each other. Let's go in and take the spoils. Now, imagine being in that moment. The Moabites are so sure of what they're seeing that they don't even pause to consider there might be another explanation. They see what they think is blood, and immediately, their minds go into overdrive. They rush toward Israel, ready to take advantage of what they believe is a victory handed to them on a silver platter. But here's the twist. Things are not what they seem. God had turned the situation completely around. The Moabites, who had been ready for battle, were now blinded by their own assumptions. They were confident they had the upper hand, but little did they know, Israel was about to surprise them. The very thing they thought was a sign of their victory, blood, was actually God's provision in disguise. The pools of water that they thought signaled death were, in fact, life-giving water for Israel's army. What looked like defeat to the Moabites was, in reality, Israel's victory. And that's when the Israelites sprung into action. As the Moabites rushed into what they thought was their victory, they were met by a fully refreshed and ready Israelite army. With the element of surprise on their side, the Israelites launched an attack, and the Moabites were quickly overwhelmed. Israel chased them down, destroyed their cities, and even went so far as to ruin their crops and fill up their wells. The Moabites, who had been confident in their victory, were now the ones retreating in defeat. The whole thing turned on its head, and what seemed like certain failure for Israel turned into an overwhelming victory. All because God worked behind the scenes to confuse their enemies. Now, let's take a step back and think about this. It's easy to look at a situation and assume we know exactly what's going on. The Moabites saw the red water and immediately thought it was blood. They assumed they were walking into a victory, but in reality, they were walking straight into defeat. How many times in life do we find ourselves in a situation where things don't look right at first glance? We make assumptions, we jump to conclusions, and sometimes we miss the bigger picture. This story is a great reminder that things aren't always what they seem. The Moabites were so sure that the sight of blood meant victory, but it was a misunderstanding of the situation. How often do we look at our circumstances and think we know what's going to happen, only for God to show up and surprise us? Maybe you're in a tough spot right now, and things seem bleak or confusing. Maybe you think you're walking into a battle you can't win. Or maybe you're facing a situation that looks like a total loss. But just like with the Moabites, God could be working behind the scenes in ways you don't understand yet. Sometimes, the way things look at first glance isn't the full picture. God is always at work, and while it may seem like defeat is on the horizon, it could actually be the setup for a victory that you can't even see yet. This is where faith comes in. We have to trust that, even when things don't look the way we expect, God has a plan. The Moabites were fooled by what they saw, but Israel, on the other hand, trusted in God's provision, even when it came in an unexpected form. They dug ditches, they took action, and they stayed faithful, even when things didn't look like they were going to work out. And because of that, God gave them the victory. So when you're facing a situation where things seem off or uncertain, remember this story. What you're seeing right now may not be the whole story. Trust that God is working in ways you can't always see, and that He's turning things around, even when it looks like all hope is lost. He's a God who loves to surprise us, and sometimes the miracle is just waiting for us to keep moving forward, even when we don't have all the answers. As we come to the end of this incredible journey through the miracles of Elisha, I think we can draw some pretty powerful lessons about faith and obedience. Throughout his life, Elisha was a living example of what it means to trust God, even when the odds are stacked against you, and even when the path forward doesn't seem clear. But one of the biggest takeaways from his story is this: sometimes God asks us to take action before we see the results. Think about it. Every miracle Elisha performed involved some kind of step of faith. Whether it was the healing of a sick person, multiplying food, or making an axe head float, there was always an element of obedience involved. The people didn't just sit around and wait for God to do everything for them. They had to do their part, even when the outcome wasn't immediately obvious. For example, in the story where the army was in the desert and the ditches had to be dug, God could have easily sent rain from the sky. But instead, He asked them to dig ditches first. That's the kind of faith we're talking about. It's not just about waiting for something to happen, it's about taking action, even when there's no visible sign of change. And when they did, God filled those ditches with water, just as He promised. But here's the thing, they had to dig the ditches first. That's often how God works. He wants us to move in faith, even when the circumstances don't seem to line up. He calls us to act in obedience before the miracle happens. And when we do that, when we take that step of faith, no matter how small, it opens the door for God to move in ways we can't even imagine. It's so easy to get caught in the trap of waiting for the perfect moment, right? We wait for all the signs to line up, for everything to be just right before we take that step. But sometimes, God doesn't work like that. Sometimes He asks us to move even when things don't look perfect. He wants to see if we're willing to trust Him enough to act, even when we don't have all the answers. And here's the thing, faith isn't just about hoping for a miracle. It's about believing that God is working, even when we can't see it. Elisha's miracles weren't about showing off or proving something. They were about showing the people of Israel that God was still at work, that he hadn't abandoned them. And in the same way, God is still at work in our lives today. Even when things seem uncertain or impossible, he's there, moving behind the scenes. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that sometimes the miracle we're waiting for starts with the first step of faith. Maybe God is calling you to take a step in a relationship, in your job, or in your finances. Maybe there's something he's been asking you to do for a while, but you've been waiting for the perfect moment. But the truth is, that moment may never come unless you take the first step. And here's the good news. When we act in faith, God is always faithful to do his part. We may not always see the results right away, and things may not always go according to our plan. But just like with Elisha's miracles, God is at work, and he'll always come through. The key is staying faithful, staying obedient, and trusting that he knows what he's doing. In the end, the miracles we read about in Elisha's life weren't just about showing God's power, they were about showing his love and faithfulness to his people. And that's the same for us today. God is faithful to his promises. He wants to work miracles in our lives, but sometimes he's waiting for us to take that step of faith. So, what's the step of faith that God is calling you to take right now? Whatever it is, know that when you act in obedience, you're making room for God to move. And trust me, when you do, you'll see his faithfulness in ways that will leave you in awe. Just like Elisha's miracles, your faith in action will open the door for God's incredible work to unfold. Well, that's it for today's episode. I hope you've been encouraged by the story of Elisha and the powerful lessons about faith, obedience, and trusting God even when we don't have all the answers. Remember, when we take steps of faith, even in the middle of uncertainty, God is always at work behind the scenes. If you enjoyed this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on more insights and reflections in future episodes. We've got so much more to explore together, and I can't wait to dive into it with you. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.